Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into event sourcing today, specifically how these systems, where every single change is logged as an event, how they adapt as the needs of a system change over time.
Sounds pretty complex.
It can be, but also super fascinating. Think of it like a system that remembers every step it took to get to its current state, not just the end result.
Oh, I'm starting to get the picture. So what's guiding our deep dive today?
We've got this awesome article from the Essence Tech team. They've clearly wrestled with these challenges in the real world.
Always love to see how theory meets practice. So what jumped out at you about their approach?
For me, it's keeping it from becoming a tangled mess as you add new features and requirements. It's one thing to build an event sourcing system from scratch, but how do you make sure it stays manageable as things evolve?
Ah, yeah, that's the tricky part. Well, one of the first things they highlight is that the events themselves, the things you're logging, those need to evolve too.
Makes sense. As systems grow, you're going to need to track more information. Like,
Hmm.
if you started with a simple order created event, you might later want to add a delivery method field.
Right. Got to know if the customer chose overnight shipping or standard. But then what happens when you try to replay those older events? They don't have that field.
Exactly, you'd run into compatibility issues.
So this is where versioning comes in. The Sensence Tech folks talk about using a mapping process, kind of like think about software updates on your phone.
Yeah, sometimes older data needs to be converted to work with the new app version.
That's exactly it. So they're essentially translating those older events on the fly to make sure everything stays compatible.
Clever. But couldn't you end up with, like, a bunch of different versioning strategies across the system as it gets bigger?
Oh, for sure. That's a real danger. I think that's where system-wide versioning standards and really careful planning come in.
Makes me think about how, in software development, there are all these different branching strategies for managing code changes. Could you apply something similar to event versions?
That's a great parallel. It really highlights how event sourcing needs that kind of software development thinking, those best practices, not just technical expertise with the events themselves.
So it's really about the whole ecosystem. Now, speaking of evolving, what about the logic behind how these events are used? It's not just what you're storing, but how you're actually using that data that changes over time.
Oh, absolutely. And the article dives into this a bit with what they call versioning the domain logic. A good example is like calculating an order total with currency exchange.
Yeah, because today's exchange rate could be totally different than when the order was placed.
Right. If you just replayed the events using today's rate, your total would be way off.
So how do you make sure those calculations stay consistent over time?
What they suggest is storing the relevant information at the time of the event itself. So in that example, you'd store the exchange rate that was used when the order was created.
Makes sense. It's like taking a snapshot in time, freezing all those important variables.
Precisely. That way, when you replay the events, you're using the exact same information that was available back then. But this also brings up an interesting question. What if the business changes the way it calculates order totals, like introduces a new fee? How would you handle that in an event-sourced system where you can't change past events?
That's a tricky one. Do you rewrite history or find a way to layer those new calculations on top? It's like you're balancing historical accuracy with the need to reflect the current rules.
Exactly. And that's where having that deep understanding of your specific domain and how it might change comes in.
Definitely makes you think differently about how you design these systems. It's not just tacking on new events as you go. Now, we can't talk about all this data without mentioning GDPR and the right to be forgotten. Event sourcing is all about keeping a complete record. So what happens when a user wants their data wiped?
It's definitely a unique challenge since immutability, not being able to change the events, is a key principle of event sourcing. Deleting events could mess everything up. The Ascens Tech article mentions a couple of ways to approach this.
Oh, like what?
Well, one is encryption. If you encrypt the personal data within an event and then delete the decryption key, poof, the data is basically inaccessible. It's like redacting sensitive info from a document.
Clever. It's still there, but you can't read it.
Right. And the other method they mentioned is having separate event streams, one for public data and one for private data. So if a user says, forget me, you just delete the private stream.
Ah. So like having different levels of access to information depending on who you are, I guess that would give you more control over privacy.
Exactly. It really highlights how there isn't one perfect answer. It's about weighing the trade-offs and figuring out what works best in your specific context.
This has been super insightful. We've touched on a lot. How the events themselves need to adapt, and even how to deal with data privacy.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much to explore when it comes to how event sourcing systems handle change.
Well, listeners, we'll be back soon to dig even deeper.
Welcome back. Ready to dig deeper into how these event source systems evolve?
Absolutely. We've talked about individual events evolving, but what about the whole system? How does it change as the business itself grows? The Essence Tech article used examples like, simple online orders, but what happens when you add more complex things, like subscriptions?
That's where things get really interesting. It's not just tweaking a field here or there. You might have to rethink the entire structure of events, maybe introduce totally new types or seriously refactor existing ones.
So you're like changing the fundamental building blocks of the system. How do you do that without causing a total meltdown?
Well, the article mentions domain-driven design, and I think that's really relevant here.
Domain-driven design, right? Could you give me a quick refresher on how that ties in?
Basically, you start by deeply understanding the domain, which is the core logic and activities of the business. So, like, if you're building an e-commerce platform, you'd think about stuff like orders, payments, inventory, that kind of thing.
So you're saying figure out what your system is actually doing at a high level before you jump into the technical stuff about events and data structures.
Exactly. It's like having a blueprint before you start building a house. It gives you a solid foundation that can handle changes later on.
It makes me realize how important it is to get those domain experts involved early on. They're the ones who really understand all the nuances of the business.
Oh, for sure. That collaboration between the tech folks and the business folks, it's super important.
It's like needing to be fluent in both tech speak and business speak. But let's get back to the practical stuff. How does this actually play out when you need to make these big changes to the system?
Let's say you started with a basic system for like simple online orders. Then the business says, hey, we want to offer subscriptions. Suddenly, you've got to capture all these new events related to recurring billing, managing subscription cycles, handling cancellations, all that stuff.
That's a whole other layer of complexity.
Yeah.
And you'd have to figure out how these new events relate to the older ones for orders, payments, customer info, everything.
Exactly. And that's why that planning and foresight we talked about earlier is so important.
So versioning comes into play again, right? Not just for individual events, but for the whole event model.
You got it. It's like having different versions of your blueprint as you renovate and expand a house. You wouldn't demolish the whole thing every time you wanted to make a change.
Right. You need a way to manage changes gradually so everything stays stable.
Yeah.
How do you find that balance? Between making changes and keeping the system from falling apart, are there any specific tools or strategies?
That's where it gets really tricky. The article doesn't get into a ton of detail there, but I bet you could borrow some techniques from software development. Stuff like branching strategies or modular design.
So it's not just about knowing the technical ins and outs of events and data. It's about having that broader software engineering and architecture mindset.
For sure. And just like how software architecture has evolved with things like microservices and cloud-native design, I think we'll see similar innovations in event source systems too.
Okay, so we've covered evolving individual events and the overall model. But what about actually using that data that's been so carefully stored?
Oh, yes. That's where projections come in. They're often overlooked, but so important in event sourcing.
Remind me, what exactly is a projection?
Think of it as a custom view of the data in your event stream. It takes those raw events and transforms them into something you can actually use for a specific purpose.
So like in our e-commerce example, you might have a projection that generates customer invoices or a real-time dashboard showing sales trends.
Exactly. Or maybe you have another projection that's feeding data into a machine learning model for like fraud detection or personalized recommendations.
So you could have multiple projections running at the same time, each one showing you a different side of the same data.
Exactly. Each one gives you a different lens to view the same reality.
I love that analogy. But just like events, projections probably need to change as the system changes too, right?
Oh, absolutely. If you add new events or change the logic behind the old ones, your projections need to keep up.
So it's all about keeping those projections in sync with everything else that's changing.
Right. And you also have to think about performance. As your event store gets bigger and you have more projections running, things can slow down.
It's a trade-off then, right?
Yeah.
You have this amazing history, but it might take longer to process as things scale.
Yeah, you got to think about that early on. Things like snapshotting can help. It's like saving a summary of the current state so you don't have to read through the entire history every time.
What about other ways to design the system to help with performance?
Yeah, there are definitely things you can do, like event partitioning. where you divide the event stream into smaller chunks, or using databases that are specifically designed for this kind of data.
So it's not just about capturing the events, it's about having the right infrastructure to handle them.
Exactly. And that infrastructure might need to change over time, too. You might need to scale your database, add more processing power, or use caching. It's a constant process of adapting and making things better.
And remember we talked about GDPR and the right to be forgotten? How does that affect projections? They could have personal data too, right?
Oh, definitely. You've got to address that, too. And that's where that user-forgotten event we talked about before can be really helpful.
You mean using that event to tell the projections to get rid of the user's data?
Yep. It's like having a cleanup crew that automatically goes through all your projections and removes any trace of that user.
So it's not just events that need to evolve, it's the whole ecosystem.
It really shows how event sourcing is more than just some technical detail. It's a whole new way of thinking about how systems work and change.
It's about seeing the big picture. And speaking of big picture, what are some of the challenges or things that can go wrong when you're trying to evolve these systems?
Let's take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll dive into some of those potential pitfalls.
Welcome back, everyone. I feel like we've learned so much about how event source systems evolve. But, got to be realistic. No system is perfect, right?
Yeah.
Even with the best planning, things can still get messy as the system grows. What are some of those pitfalls that teams often run into?
You're absolutely right. It's not always a walk in the park. I think one common mistake is underestimating just how complex these systems can become over time.
It's like you start out thinking, oh, we'll just log all these events, it'll all work out. But as we've seen, it's a lot more involved than that.
Exactly. You need to be ready to commit to that continuous process of versioning, evolving your model, just constantly adapting your thinking as the system grows.
So it's a long-term commitment.
Definitely. And that leads to another potential issue, neglecting the human element. Event sourcing is often a pretty big shift in how developers think, so you really need a team that's willing to learn and adapt.
You can't just throw new technology at people and expect them to become experts right away.
Exactly. It takes training, good documentation, a culture that embraces learning, and don't forget about testing and processes for managing changes. Those are super important.
Makes me think about how important it is to pick the right team for this kind of project. It's not just about their technical skills, it's their mindset too.
Absolutely. Speaking of challenges, performance can also become a major headache. As your event store gets huge, replaying all those events to figure out the current state, that can really slow things down.
So it's like we have this awesome record of everything that happened, but it comes at a cost when the system gets really big.
Yeah, that's something you have to consider from the start. Things like snapshotting, saving a snapshot of the current state every so often, that can help.
Are there any other techniques that can help with performance?
Oh, yeah. You can partition your events, break them up into smaller chunks, or you can use special databases that are built to handle event streams really efficiently.
So it's about choosing the right infrastructure, making sure it can handle the load as things grow.
Right. And remember, that infrastructure might need to evolve too. You might need to scale your database, upgrade your hardware, or implement some clever caching.
It never really stops, does it? Always adapting.
hmm
Any other pitfalls we should keep in mind?
One more that's really important is data inconsistency, especially when you have systems that are spread out, distributed across multiple servers.
Yeah, because if one part of the system falls behind or processes things out of order, that could cause a real mess.
Exactly. You need solid ways to make sure events are processed in the right order and that any errors are handled gracefully. That's where the idea of eventual consistency comes in.
Eventual consistency.
It basically means accepting that the system might be a little out of sync for a short time, but it will eventually catch up and become consistent again.
It's like allowing for a little bit of lag, knowing that things will eventually sort themselves out.
Precisely. It's often a necessary trade-off in these large-scale systems.
Wow. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah.
It's clear that evolving event source systems can be super powerful, but it's definitely not a simple task.
Totally agree. For me, the big takeaway is this. Event sourcing is an awesome tool, but it's not a magic solution. You need to be ready to plan carefully, to keep adapting, and to be open to constantly learning as your system evolves.
It's about having the right mindset as much as it is about having the right tech skills.
Yeah.
It's really exciting to see how this whole approach is evolving.
It is. And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep experimenting, and never stop learning. The future of event sourcing is bright, and I can't wait to see what we come up with next.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into event sourcing. Until next time, keep those events flowing.